Tonight we have a sci-fi-esque horror story called A Terrifying Trip to Ancient Rome. Let's get started. A blank screen, roughly my height and 2 of my arm spans in length, towers in front of us. How do I turn it on? I muttered out loud, placing a hand on the back of my neck and leaning closer to the monitor. Nathan reached forward and tapped it. The screen lit up with icons in a variety of shapes and colors. One said, restaurants, and I clicked it. The screen changed, now displaying different countries, Italy, India, Mexico. Nathan tucked a strand of blonde hair behind my ear before he smiled down at me and explained, if you click on the countries, you'll actually go to the restaurant. For instance, if you pick this one, and he carefully points to a restaurant in the Tuscan countryside. We'll go to the restaurant, surrounded by rolling hills of the Tuscan countryside. Or, if you hit this one, we'll be dropped into the heart of downtown New Delhi. You can try foods in time periods you've never been a part of. Do you want to lunch at a popina in ancient Rome? I turned around to face him, smirking, with my hands on my hips. Do I want to go to lunch in ancient Rome? Yes. I can't even tell you how much I want to go to lunch in ancient Rome. I grabbed his hand and jumped up and down. Do I just push the button? Yes, go ahead. You won't even feel like you're traveling anywhere. Through my excitement, nerve broke through and made my stomach feel empty, and I barely had enough spit to swallow. I've never done this before. I reached a shaky finger out and touched the latest icon to appear on the screen. It was in the form of an L-shaped counter, with people milling around it, and under it said, Popina, Ancient Rome. As I moved my finger back from the screen, the noise of people talking burst into my ears, as shocking as a quick immersion into cold water. Unbidden, I inhaled deeply. Nathan and I stood in the middle of a street as loads of people filed past us, going about their daily business. Nathan changed with the location and was now wearing a long beige-colored shirt with a belt that cinched at the waist. On his feet were the classic Roman sandals. I took in his new appearance and laughed and joked, No toga, you must be part of the lower classes. I'm dressed better, in a long, bright blue dress that descended all the way down to my toes. On my feet were elegant white shoes. I shifted and pulled at the 2 tight belts around my waist and under my breasts. On my head sat a scarf that draped all the way down to my knees, similar to what the Virgin Mary wore in every painting of her. Let's go to the popina! I want to try what the ancients ate. It's crazy how crowded it is. It's like being in a club on Saturday night. I can hardly move, I said to Nathan as I pushed his muscular frame away from the bulk of the people. Nathan grabbed my hand, and a rush filled my stomach at his touch. He led me about a block farther along to a place somehow more crowded, with people milling around outside an open-aired eatery located on the bottom floor of a rather tall-looking building. I held Nathan's arm close to my body and whispered in his ear, I know it wouldn't really be very authentic, but can we have the people around us speak English? He quickly placed his hand over his lips and stopped walking. Then he whispered back, Wouldn't you rather just be able to understand Latin? We could do that? I asked as my breath caught in my throat. Of course. We'll just rewire your brain as if you've been speaking Latin your whole life. Want to do that? He asked. I nodded slowly and then thought of all those hours I had spent studying and practicing Italian, and I had only managed to become conversational. And here, in seconds, I can have my brain rewritten with no effort, and I can understand a language that I've only ever heard spoken in horror movies about exorcisms. Gradually, like emerging from a fog, the conversations around me became clear. Off to my right, a man shouted, Come on, Borden, don't skimp on me. A child wearing a long beige tunic, similar to Nathan's but much dirtier, ran by, and grabbed some olives off of a man's plate. The child kept running as he shoved the olives in his mouth, and the previous owner of the olives yelled, "Stop him!" No one moved to intervene, and the man turned back to his food to eat what was left. Nathan and I pushed our way up to the eatery. The counter was against the front wall inside the building. Waiters buzzed around, taking food out of holes in the center of the counter with large ladles, and poured the contents onto plates. We took a seat at one of the tables nearby. The smell of cooking meat permeated the air, and my mouth started to water. Mixed with the meat, there was another herby scent that I couldn't place. I turned to Nathan and asked, "What herb is in the meat?" "Rosemary," he replied, raising his dark eyebrows. "Ah, yeah. Of course, the Italians and their rosemary, even in ancient times." The serving girl at the counter wore a long dress similar to mine, but without the shawl over her head. She handed out both plates and cups to those seated at the counter. Next to her, a man gathered legumes and other foods out of holes in the center of the counter and put the food on plates. Glancing around, I noticed an abundance of flies eating something off of the counter and decided on my own to eliminate the bugs. I concentrated, and I thought, and I made the flies disappear. And Nathan commented, "Hey, you're figuring it out. Good job." "Thanks," I said, with a small smile as my face flushed red. The sensation passed, and I focused back on the business at hand, ordering our food. After setting the plate of legumes down on another table, the waiter headed over to us and said, "Want the special?" I glanced over at Nathan, and then back to the waiter and said, "Yes?" 2 plates, and 2 wines. Without another word, the waiter turned back to the counter, grabbed 2 plates, and filled them with food. Then he picked up 2 cups and filled them with a light-colored liquid. Upon his return, he placed the food silently in front of us and looked pointedly at Nathan. Nathan grabbed a small pouch that I missed when I was first checking out his outfit. He shook out 2 coins and handed them to the waiter, who placed them in his own pouch and left. With that monetary exchange over, I turned my attention back to the food. It was simple fare: olives, cheese, a reddish-brown bun, some legumes, figs, and a glass of wine. I picked up the wine and then set it back down immediately, startled. "It's hot," I said. Yeah, that's how they like it. Try it. It's not terrible," he replied. "Wow, it's not terrible. You should go into sales," I quipped and then snickered. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath before I tentatively brought the cup to my lips and then sipped it. It really wasn't terrible, although I would say the beverage was more water than wine. I picked up the fig, took a bite, and felt relieved that it tasted just like the figs I'm used to. Setting the fig down, I turned my attention to the bun and took a bite. It was nutty and a little sweet. I moved on to the olives, and like the figs, they tasted like the olives I'm used to. Finally, I grabbed the cheese and tried it. It was soft and tangy. Delicious. Nathan watched this unfold, half frowning. "Are you done eating your food like it might bite back?" he asked. "Oh, this is all very new, okay? It's weird being in this world. It's weird seeing you again. You're just like I remember you, but you died, 15 years ago?" A lump pressed on my throat, but I didn't want to focus on that right now, so I pushed the feelings aside. What kind of cheese is this?" "It's goat cheese. Try spreading it on your bread." "And I get it. It's weird to see me again, but I should be exactly like your Nathan. I have all of his memories, his feelings," he explained, scooting closer and rubbing my back. I brushed a stray tear away and swallowed hard. Real Nathan wouldn't say that, like no human would say that, I said, shaking my head. I searched the area in front of me, and there were no eating utensils. "Didn't Romans use eating utensils?" I asked Nathan. "They use knives and spoons, but just rip off a piece of your bread and use it to grab cheese, like you do with the naan when you're eating curry." "Oh yeah, I know how to do that," I said, grateful for the distraction. and grabbed some cheese with my bread and then popped it in my mouth. A smile spread over my face as the simple flavors filled my mouth. Bread and cheese. Simple pleasures are the best sometimes. Just then, I heard the stomp of heavy feet headed in my direction. Nathan's head snapped up and stared over my shoulder. Then he stood up and dragged me out of my chair by my elbow so that I stood behind him. "What is this?" Nathan asked. "This isn't part of the program." 3 tall men stood in front of him, wearing armor and carrying swords. Nathan reached his hands back while still facing the men and pulled me closer to him. Without a word, the men grabbed his tunic and moved him aside. I tried to stay with him, holding on to his arms and then his tunic with my fingers, but one man grabbed my wrist while another extracted my fingers from their grip on Nathan's tunic. I tried to pull my hands back and shouted, "Stop! Cancel! Get me out of here! Something broke!" But nothing happened. The last thing I saw was Nathan fighting against one of the men before the other 2 pulled me out of the eatery. Waking up, my eyes cracked open and I caught a glimpse of cobblestone. I shut my eyes again as the sound of something scraping entered my consciousness. I jerked my head up, fully awake. 2 men stomped along on either side of me. They held me by my elbow as my chest hung forward, and the scraping sound I heard was the tops of my sandals dragging along the road. My arms ached, my shoulder ligaments overstretched from the awkward angle and from supporting my weight. I flexed my legs, then scrambled to get them underneath me. The guards next to me allowed this, but still held me by my elbows. More comfortable, I reflected on what had just happened. I was lunching with Nathan, and then these guys took me away and were going where? Why is this happening? Is this part of the program? This is supposed to be therapeutic. I'm supposed to have the opportunity to make amends with my dead husband, relieve myself of guilt. But what makes me want to vomit about this situation is that I asked the program to stop. I said no, and it kept going. My therapist wouldn't do that, and it's probably illegal to keep going when someone in therapy clearly asks you to stop. So what's going on? Fully awake to my situation, a scream built up in my chest, but I pushed it back down. I'm literally in my head right now, so no one in the real world will hear my screams. I turned my head towards one of the guards. "Why are you doing this? What's going on? Where are we going?" He ignored me completely. Like no sound registered, like I didn't say anything. I closed my eyes and thought about how back at the Popina I could make the flies disappear by just thinking about them. Maybe I can make that happen again. I concentrated on the guards releasing their grip on my arms. I opened my eyes, and it hadn't worked. The guards kept their grip. I tried again, and again. Then I tried to make something little happen. I thought about the flies coming back, but that didn't work either. My chin trembled, but I pressed my lips together, and I began to breathe quickly. Just try to figure out what's going on, I told myself. I focused on what I could see. We continued along a road that looked similar to a city street of today, but still clearly from the past. We were surrounded on both sides of the road by shops, most of which were only a floor or 2 in height. I remembered reading a long time ago that the wealthier people lived on the lower floors, whereas those less fortunate lived at the highest level. If there was a fire, as there often was in this period, the wealthier people would have a better chance of getting out of the building alive. Then I saw a sliver of the Colosseum down the road. I've seen it many times in its modern, deteriorated state, but as I looked at it now, it was whole and appeared almost golden in the sunlight. Before moving towards the Colosseum, the guards tugged me past the shiny bronze statue of Nero as he leaned on a pillar. At this point, though, the statue wasn't Nero anymore. It was turned into the sun god Helios, and he wore a spiky crown on top of his head. I craned my neck to gaze up, like an ant in front of this nearly 100-foot tall statue which stood before us, naked and chiseled. Standing even taller than a statue of Nero, the Colosseum appeared unreal. Every arcade on the upper levels of the Colosseum contained a colorful statue of gods or heroes created larger than the average height of a man. Despite my circumstances, I gawked at the grand beauty of this place, while the other Romans pushed past us, already too used to this elegance to appreciate it anymore, and too used to prisoners to pay me any attention. As we got closer, I felt the sound of the audience radiate out around us. The excitement and noise thundered through my body like a physical force. We continued beyond the ticket counter and into the stadium. We passed numbered arcades and an incredibly beautiful hall filled with colorful mythological and other painted scenes. Little did I know, I was about to see mythology brought to life in the most horrific way. The Colosseum. The guards dragged me into the stadium seating, where they plopped down on either side of me. We were seated in the same row as the Emperor and Vestal Virgins. From here, one can clearly see sweat roll off of the gladiators and blood spurt from the gore of their wounds. Despite our honorable placement, I sat on the hard stone surface, while the guards had cushions. Almost immediately, my legs started to go to sleep. I stood up to shake out my legs, but the guards pulled me right back down. I sighed and gazed out at the stadium floor. In front of me wasn't the open pit I had become familiar with as a tourist, but rather an intricate maze with walls made of wood much higher than the heads of the men standing near them. The Colosseum was arranged so that we could see into the top of the maze from our seats and knew the layout like omniscient gods. From inside the maze, you would only be able to see the wood that surrounded you and perhaps some of the citizens in the upper seats. Outside of the maze stood men dressed in leather-plated breastplates and helmets with a thick row of red feathers almost like a mohawk, leading 3 other men towards the maze. These men wore the standard beige tunic, except that theirs were clearly worn with holes and stains covering them. The men struggled and dug their heels into the ground. "Please, no, please!" yelled one man as he was dragged towards one of the entrances of the maze. The man's eyes bugged out of his face and his hands clasped over his ears. The other 2 men made similar pleas, with one asking for forgiveness. Evidently, the guards were not the forgiving type, and they forced the men toward their fate. Within the round edges of the Colosseum, the maze was a square. One side of the square pressed up flush to the edge of the Colosseum. The other 3 sides had roughly 20 feet between them and the edge of the Colosseum. On each of the 3 sides was an entrance with a door that could be locked shut. The guards split up so that each prisoner had 2 guards dragging him, just like I had next to me. The guards maneuvered the prisoners so that each one ended up at a different entrance. Then, as one guard held the prisoner, the other guard lifted a black iron lever out of his holster to unlock the door and opened it. At that point, The guards must have given each other some signal because they all shoved their captive into the maze at the same time and closed and locked the door behind them. "These men have committed terrible crimes," one guard whispered in my ear, and I jumped. I stared at him, waiting for more information, but he sat back up straight and ignored me again. Once inside the maze, all the men turned around immediately and tried to get back out by banging against the doors, but all the exits held fast, and not one of them escaped. Next, one prisoner tried to scale the wooden frame, but it was built so tall that he couldn't reach the top even when he jumped. Another looked up at the wall before him, as if to see if it would be worth jumping, but being a rather short man, he didn't even try. The last one was rather fat, and he slumped against the ground and started crying, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes. "You're getting what you deserve," yelled someone behind me. I turned around to see a young man with curly, dark hair who had stood up to make his remark. To my left, another man shouted, "Murderer! Scum!" All around us, people jeered and cursed the men. No sympathy in the crowd. In great contrast to the cacophony, at once the crowd fell silent as a roar ripped through the air. Goosebumps rose on my arms and my ears perked up. When the 3 prisoners heard the noise, all whipped around to face the sound. The part of the maze flush to the side of the Colosseum contained a 4th door, and from it entered a large male lion. The lion had roared because a guard had jabbed it from behind with a long spear, and then quickly shut the entrance. The lion surveyed his surroundings with fire in his eyes and hunger in his belly. He was gaunt, with ribs pressing through his skin. The emperor must have been keeping him hungry. The mighty king of the savannah swung his bushy mane and sniffed the air, then foamed at the mouth. He could smell the panic of the men in the maze. Gracefully, the lion stalked around his wooden territory, seemingly intent on finding one of the prisoners. His paws landed silently on the ground, and since the men in the maze lacked the aerial view of the audience, they stood quivering in their unknowing. One of the men to the lion's right tried to walk away from his starting point, but the gravel under his shoes created a noise that caught the lion's attention, and the beast turned his focus in the direction of this man. Realizing his mistake, the man froze. The other men in the pit must have also heard the noise because they looked in the direction of that 3rd man. The lion turned to his right and crept closer, but after only 5 feet was thwarted by one of the walls, which forced him to take a left. The lion turned and continued his silent walk. The men stayed frozen. The punishment continues in the Colosseum. As the lion continued to hunt the men in the maze, half the audience watched in silent anticipation, while the other half continued to cheer at the men, and others cheered on the lion. The crowd knew what was going to happen as the lion came to a crossway and chose to turn left, again towards a new victim, instead of going right towards the one who had originally made the noise. Perhaps he could smell that that man was closer. The crowd knew this new victim's name and began to chant, "Death to Gregorio! Death to Gregorio! Murderer!" The Gregorio in question was the short man who didn't even bother to try to jump the wall. He glanced up sharply at the audience, appearing surprised, while the original noisemaker glanced around frantically, his hands in front of his chest like he could push the lion away. Gregorio backed himself up against the wall, turning his head left and right, but seeing nothing. Of course he didn't see anything, because the lion hadn't made the final turn. The tension in the crowd rose to a peak as the lion slowly closed the distance between him and Gregorio. As Gregorio continued to look side to side, he finally saw one of the lion's massive paws come around the turn, followed by his 400-pound body. The lion faced Gregorio, who did nothing except stand and stare at the large beast. It appeared the lion, too, stood still, but then, quick as a wind, the lion took off towards Gregorio. Gregorio had no time to move before sharp claws pushed him onto his back, knocking the wind out of him. Gregorio tried to curl into the fetal position and moved to bring his arms around his face, but the lion was too quick. He bit down on Gregorio's head, ripping off his face. Gregorio continued to struggle as the skin on his face flapped open. The lion popped one of his eyeballs. Then, in a gesture of efficiency, the lion went straight for Gregorio's neck, clamped his teeth down, and shook him until he broke his neck. Throughout his ordeal, Gregorio screamed, first in shock, then in pain, and then there was silence except for the sound of the lion chewing on Gregorio's flesh and bones, which we could hear because we were so close to the action. The sound of the crowd cheering the lion on and the throwing of curses continued even as the man lay dead. The other two men heard this and knew that just because the lion had fed on the other prisoner instead of them, they knew they would not be set free. Coming back into my own body, I realized that I had become frozen just like the remaining two prisoners. My mouth was dry, and I felt as if I had never been more in the present moment than I was then. I tried to lick my lips, but there was no spit. The smell of blood and carnage wafted towards us, and I began to feel sick. My mouth watered, and I bent over even as I sat. All the food I had eaten at the Popina rushed out of my mouth in several heaves. The guards next to me didn't move. When I finished, I turned to a guard. "Can I have some water?" He revealed nothing, but continued to face straight ahead towards the arena. The odor of vomit mixed with the smell of blood, and I wanted to throw up again, but there was nothing left except dry heaves. Eventually, this also passed, and I placed some of my shawl over my nose to block the noxious scents. The reality of what I witnessed began to sink in, and I thought of all the poor people who actually died this way, but I couldn't focus on that now. That happened in the past, and this isn't real. I focused only on that thought and repeated it to myself. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. It worked until I thought of Gregorio's face. He was so scared, I thought as my eyebrows knit together. I pressed my eyes shut and silently bit the air while I shook and cried. I didn't notice while I was vomiting or crying, but during my entire episode, the audience had frozen. People stood near us with arms raised, hands and fists and mouths wide open mid-curse. Others sat still, looking mildly disgusted yet intrigued by the slaughter unfolding before them. The silence felt unreal compared to the noise the audience gave off. Looking around, their gestures alone spoke of loud noises, not to mention the absolute racket they normally created. I was the only one moving. Even the lion and the prisoners stood perfectly still, frozen in time. I guess I have to watch the whole show, I thought. Immediately after that thought, the audience charged back to life, and with it came the sound, even more deafening than before. In the scene before me, the lion was still tearing into the body of Gregorio. The other prisoners, assuming the lion to be sufficiently distracted, cautiously began to explore away from their home base. As a member of the audience, we could see weapons placed around the maze, presumably not to give the men a fighting chance, but rather to increase the spectacle for the audience. The two men were far away from each other, so the chances of one being able to reach the other and join forces appeared unlikely. The tall man, who had tried to jump the wall and save himself, crept forward at a slant, keeping one hand on the wall and tiptoeing forward. The other man, the plump one who had sat down to cry, advanced in a crouch close to the ground. Just then, the tall man happened upon a sword. He picked it up and held it in front of him, and seeming not to know what to do next, he simply stood there looking at the sword. He lifted it in front of him, placed his back to the wall, and decided to stay put for the time being. The other man still hadn't found any weapons. He continued to move forward, scouring the ground to find something, a weapon, or better, a flaw in the maze that would allow him to escape. He knew better, though. They both did. They both grew up watching shows similar to this, and they knew that while gladiators might be able to move on to fight another day, the prisoners did not. One way or another, they would die this day. It was just a matter of how. The lion slowed down his destruction of Gregorio's remains. He licked his lips and stretched his mighty limbs. He settled down next to the remains of the body, like a cat settling in a sunspot. As the lion decreased his noise levels, the other two prisoners stopped all movement once again. The lion was no longer distracted by the kill, and the sound of his feasting would no longer cover their movements. The tall man with the sword tightened his grip, bent and straightened his knees slightly, and continued to stand with his back to the maze wall. The other one stopped walking and stayed crouched over. The guards seemed to find this lack of action unacceptable. They looked up at the emperor for guidance, and at a sign from him, they opened the fourth entrance again. Through it came yet another lion, this one just as lean and hungry as the first one, or perhaps more so, as this one needed no prodding and thus created no roar. He stalked forward like a man on a mission. This lion turned right, then left, and then he found the prisoner who, mid-crouch, had found no weapon. Completely overcome by shock, the man flung himself to the floor, gave one cry, and then said no more as a lion tore into his neck. The final man heard the second prisoner die and tightened his grip on the sword. Because I was so close to the maze, I could spot the sword shaking ever so slightly. Once the audience had finished enjoying the second kill, a sound came from the fourth entrance. It sounded like pennies in a jar. The lions stood up and, after some maneuvering through the maze, found their way out through the fourth entrance. There was no need to kill the lions at this point. That could happen later in the day. The last man, having seen these shows before, knew what that meant. With the lions gone, a large muscular man wearing leather-bound shin guards and a pleated leather skirt with a breastplate like the guards walked through the fourth entrance, and the audience roared its approval. The time for the gladiator fights had arrived, and this gladiator was a favorite. The man strode forward as if the arena were his home. He walked just as confident and just as hungry as the lions, except what fed this man wasn't meat. It was fame. The prisoner allowed his shoulders to drop away from his ears when he heard the lions depart, but then tensed back up when he heard the crowd cheer for the gladiator. He knew this gladiator's reputation. Everyone did, and he peed himself. The dirt around him darkened while the crowd laughed at him. "Usurer!" they shouted. The gladiator continued his search. He came upon the remains of Gregorio and kicked his detached arm out of the way, then kept going, undaunted. A couple more turns, and he found the last prisoner. The usurer placed his other hand on his sword, so he was holding it with two hands, and stumbled backward. He knew he stood no chance against this fighter. This professional killer slaughtered men, while the tall man, who clumsily held a sword, spent his days inside, lending money to the poor people of the city and demanding outrageous interest rates in return. He knew the people in the stands would enjoy watching him die. The gladiator taunted the prisoner by almost playfully hitting his sword against the one the prisoner held. He cut the prisoner's arm, then in a flash cut his cheek. He turned the sword and hit the prisoner on the side of the head with the blunt edge. The crowd laughed and the prisoner fell to his knees, the action sending up a plume of dust. The gladiator looked up towards the emperor. He did not have the power to deliver death if the man fell to his knees. In response, the emperor stood and gave the man the thumbs down. In one swift movement, the gladiator struck off the head of the prisoner, deftly ending his pain and his life. The crowd screamed to life in celebration of the gladiator's triumph over the prisoner. When the sound settled back to a more manageable level, a guard leaned over to me and whispered, "They enjoy a good bloodbath and would feel cheated if any prisoner escaped." None of the prisoners escape. But sometimes the prisoners last a while. They escape from their bonds and try scaling the sides of the pit while some hungry beast rages after them. Someone always shoots the prisoner down if they get too close to getting out. Remember that, because now it's your turn to fight. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe, as that is a great help. And stay tuned for part 4. Your turn to fight. What? I didn't want to fight. My eyes darted around the Colosseum before me. The other crowd members had twisted around to stare at me. One guy with blonde hair in a teal-green toga raised the right side of his upper lip in a snarl and leaned away from me, as if I smelled like week-old, dirty baby diapers. Around me, a chant formed. "Death to the woman! Death to the woman!" The sound pressed on my body, nearly as oppressively as the heat and glare from the sun. The guards on either side of me grabbed my elbows roughly, as if I could run away. Where could I go? We're in a simulation in my head. The guards forced me to stand and dragged me towards the arena. I shook my head. "No, no," I blubbered. My mind flashed to how accurately I tasted the food at the Popina, how acidic the vomit tasted leaving my mouth when I threw up, how real everything was here. If I get hurt in the fight, I know I'm going to feel it. But wait, if I die in my head, do I die for real? Down below were gladiators. One was lined up at each of the 3 entrance gates, not including the inner entrance gate against the side of the pit. These gladiators weren't wearing much except a pleated-looking black leather skirt, shin guards, and a very feathery helmet, their muscular chests bare. They carried no weapons, but I could see that someone had scattered a couple of weapons throughout the maze, just like they did with the prisoners. From my vantage point, as I was dragged towards the arena, I spotted one shield and one sword. None of the weapons were close to where the gladiators were standing. They were going to have to search for them, and there were not enough swords and shields for everyone. Not even close. In a blink, I entered the pit. 1 second, the guards were dragging me closer, and the next I was there. Gravel crunched under my sandals, and I was no longer wearing my long dress and headscarf. This was my one turn of luck, because I could barely move in that other outfit, let alone defend myself. I looked down to check out my new clothes. A pleated leather skirt like the other men wore, and a matching bra. even though gladiators never wore anything like sports bras. The large doors clanged open, and another gladiator entered the maze. I couldn't see him from my position, but the crowd cheered, so it must have been another favorite. The guards shut the door behind him immediately, in case some of the others decided to try a quick exit. Standing somewhere in the middle of the maze, I could only hear and guess what was happening in other parts of the maze. In front of me stood the tall wooden walls. Above the walls, I could just make out the Roman citizens in the nosebleed sections, and above them, the clear blue sky. I stretched my arms out in front of me and bent my knees, as if I could stop the swords coming at me with my hands. I pressed my back up against the wall and glanced side to side. Should I stay? Should I try to find a weapon? I didn't want to make noise by walking on the gravel, but there weren't any weapons near me. I decided to pick a direction and headed left. Immediately, the gravel crunched under my feet, as I expected, and I thought about how the lion could hear that as he hunted during the prisoner executions. I'm sure the men could hear my steps too. Stepping as lightly as possible, I followed the edge of the wall cautiously, with the fingertips of my left hand trailing the wall. I continued to hold out my right arm as well, and when I came to a right turn, I peeked my head around first and paused. I listened. Only the sounds of the other men's shoes lightly stirring up the gravel met my ears. They sounded far away, so I turned right and switched walls, so that I trailed my right fingers along the wall with my left hand stretched out. As I moved, I kept my eyes to the ground, barely breathing, scanning for weapons and shields. I found nothing. I stumbled upon a crossroads. As I carefully leaned forward, all I could see in both directions was gravel and the wooden walls of the maze. No gladiators and no weapons, left or right. I froze and listened, but I couldn't hear anything because the crowd had started up its chant again. Death to the woman! Death to the woman! I turned left, and then left again, as it was the only option. A sword leaned against the edge of one wall just a few feet in front of me. I raced towards it, but from behind I heard the sound of gravel as someone sprinted towards me. I slid over the ground and snagged the sword, jumped up and faced my attacker. It was a thin, bare-chested man, maybe 45 years old and holding a shield. He grimaced at me, his missing teeth black holes in his mouth. Noticing my sword against his shield, he performed an about-face and sprinted off in the other direction. On instinct, I grasped the sword in both hands and rushed after the man who only held a shield. This man spotted a sword, tried to bend quick to pick it up, but he was going so fast that he only skimmed the handle with his fingers and was unable to find a solid grip, so he scrambled on. I ignored this second sword and chased after my prey. He turned corners in the maze seemingly at random. A little at a time, I gained on this man. With only about 5 feet of space between us, the skinny man tripped over the foot of another man who was hiding his body behind a turn and must have heard the commotion of our chase. The man carrying the shield grunted and flew forward, his momentum sending him skidding along the ground. Behind him, I tried to stop but slid as well. My body collided into the other gladiator, who was luckily facing toward the man with the shield who had just fallen. I pushed off his sweaty, unwashed body, the odor strong in my nose. This gladiator had a barrel chest and held a sword of his own. The man with the shield who had fallen tried to use that shield to defend himself by thrusting it in front of his body as he jumped to his feet. But this new man stabbed him through the stomach, grabbed the shield, and turned to face me. The crowd roared its approval of the bloody death, then went back to their old song again. Death to the woman! Death to the woman! I gripped my sword, and using both of my sweaty hands, I stabbed it towards him. He held up the shield he had taken from the dead man. My sword clanged awkwardly off of the shield and reverberated through my arms. I considered running, but knew it would be better to just get it over with. The gladiator looked like he could outrun me. He thrusted his sword forward, and, having no shield, I jumped to the side, managing to miss the blow. But I wasn't ready for his shield, which he used like a club and slammed into my hands. I dropped my sword. I fell to the ground and attempted to grab it, but he held the sword point at my neck. The crowd continued to chant, "Death to the woman! Death to the woman!" It was clear what they wanted. I clenched my jaw and only vaguely noticed that my hand was turned at a weird angle, broken from the blow by the shield. The gladiator disregarded any rules of etiquette. He swung the shield sideways so that he hit the edge of my right knee from the side. I stumbled but didn't fall. I shifted my weight to my left leg as my eyes watered. He took his sword and cut off the flesh from my shoulder towards my elbow. My brain had accepted this situation enough that shock was wearing off, and I was starting to notice pain. The cut felt like an explosion of fire erupted on my arm. Then the gladiator stared me right in my eyes, and they looked familiar. They looked like little balls of hate. Finally, he took his sword and stabbed me in the stomach, hitting my ribs and jarring me. He twisted the blade, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the doctor's office where I had started, but my therapist was slumped over her desk, blood running out of her mouth. Back in the doctor's office, my head felt foggy, like a wet cloth covered my brain. I glanced again over to my therapist, and sure enough, a red liquid oozed out of her mouth like drool. I rubbed my eyes, but the image didn't change. My relief at finding myself still alive, even after dying in the simulation, was disappearing fast. "Ellery," I croaked. I needed water. How long was I in there? I laid on the same hospital-looking bed that I had started this journey on. The cold, hard metal bars that kept me from rolling off the bed now constrained me as I tried to move. With effort, I turned to the side and, gripping onto the bars, forced my way into a seated position. Stars appeared before my eyes and I shut my lids, allowing the dizzy spell to pass. Seconds later, heavy steps pounded down the hallway outside. I gripped the edges of the metal bars as the sound drew nearer. Through the tinted glass door was the shadow of someone short and thin, a sharp contrast to the thundering sound its footsteps made. Without hesitation, this person blasted into the office. "Ah, you're still alive, Kathy. Good. I can kill you again," said a woman I recognized. She stomped towards me, hands outstretched like claws. "Maple? Wait, how? Were you released?" I gasped. Maple paused and answered, giggling. "I convinced the panel I was no longer a threat to society, or you, and they believed me." "You were that last gladiator that killed me." I knew I recognized the eyes. "You went into the simulation on your own? How'd you get out?" I inquired, trying to buy time as I thought of a way out of this situation. I wasn't tied down, but I was weary. I'd been in that simulation much longer than I was supposed to be. The clock above the door said 4 p.m., which meant I had been laying here without food or water for 8 hours. Not exactly forever, but thirst gripped me and I felt weak. That's when I realized that I was bleeding. When the gladiator cut me in the arena, the one that went from my shoulder down to my elbow, she had really cut me. To get out on my own, I just used a safe word. If you're wondering if I could cut you from the simulation, no. I did that before I went under. You've been bleeding for an hour and a half, she explained and dipped a finger in my blood. Maple, please. I don't know how many times I've apologized to you. I didn't mean to kill your son. You know I love Nathan too. I would never hurt him. It was an accident. Maple's face scrunched up. You shouldn't have been driving. It was your fault, she raged. My own rage built up. Do you think I don't feel bad about that every day? Do you think I'm doing simulation therapy because everything is just great? I explained multiple times I was tired. We wanted to go home. He knew he was too tired to drive, and so he asked me. I thought I could. I choked on my tears, remembering. You drove the car into a tree, she answered in a level voice. It was snowing, I said pathetically. She scoffs, heading towards me with her claws out. Wait, Maple. You've already killed my therapist, or have at least injured her badly. You're going back to the psych ward. Do you even know what I'm doing here in the simulation? What do I care why you're here? From what I saw, it looks like you're using it for some weird dating service. I just know you come here once a week, so it was easy to follow you. Maple, that guy you saw me with, it was Nathan. He's in here. Couldn't you tell when you took me from the Popina? He's just like he was in life. Don't you want to see him? Maple's shoulders sagged as she bit her lip and balled her hands into fists. She turned away from me. I couldn't tell it was him. It was anonymous. I could only tell who was a real person and who was part of the simulation. I paused in silence as I dryly swallowed. Oh, Maple, I can't believe they kept this technology from you. Then I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. It was my therapist. She lay still with her head on the table, but she was awake and she winked weakly at me. Suddenly, I heard shuffling in the hallway, and about 5 men with guns stormed in through the door. They pointed the guns at Maple, who held up her hands. One of the men stepped forward and cuffed her. Maple turned her head towards me. You lied about being in there with him, didn't you? I shook my head slowly, tears building in my own throat. No, I didn't. I hope you get to try the simulation. Maybe it would help you. Then I turned my attention to my therapist. Are you okay? What happened? She pushed some hair out of her face. All I know is I was monitoring you in the Popina, and this lady came in the door and hit me in the back of the head. Then I passed out. When I woke up, you were just starting to wake up, but I was too dizzy. Then that lady came in. I managed to push the emergency button under the desk. Poor Maple. Do you think seeing her son in the simulation would have helped her? Maybe. Or maybe it would just make it more difficult to let go. For you, though, since you want to work through your guilt, I think it's helpful. She patted me on the back. I smiled at her. Thanks for saving the day. Let's go to a hospital. Thank you so much for listening. This is the last of the series. Once again, if you liked it, feel free to express that like by smashing the like button and hitting subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.